During my years as president, I learned that history does not always begin with sirens, not with the sound of tanks or formal announcements on television, but with a single sentence, a post, a statement, an operation completed, and the world often realizes the true weight of that moment weeks later. That is exactly what happened on the morning of February 28th. The United States announced that it had carried out a military operation targeting Iran's highest leadership. This was not merely a tactical move, it was a strategic rupture. When a step like this is taken, the issue is not simply the removal of a target, the issue is the rewriting of the balance of power. During my time in office, I learned this. Military power is the heaviest instrument in America's toolbox. When you use it, you do not only shake your adversary, you shake the system itself. Launching an operation is technically complex, yes, but the real complexity begins after the operation is over, because the use of force is a beginning, not an end. Tensions between the United States and Iran are not new. Decades of mutual distrust, proxy conflicts, sanctions, and disputes over nuclear ambitions have shaped this relationship. Diplomacy has sometimes advanced, sometimes collapsed, but at least there was a channel, there was a negotiating framework, there was a structure. That framework may now be gone. Targeting a leader, especially in a state with a strong ideological and security apparatus, does not merely create a personal vacancy. In such systems, a power vacuum rarely empowers moderation. It often creates space for harder forces. History has shown this repeatedly. The critical question is this: what is the second act of this operation? Foreign policy is not a one-move chess game. If you have not planned the second, third, and fourth steps, your first move, no matter how powerful, can place you in a weaker position. More importantly, actions like this do not concern only two nations. American bases in the Gulf, Israel's security, energy corridors, NATO allies, Russia's strategic calculus, China's long-term positioning, all are part of this equation. When you make a decision, you trigger chain reactions, and the most dangerous moments in history are when leaders cannot keep pace with the consequences of their own actions. The world may be standing at such a threshold right now. When you are president, the military option is always on the table. That is the reality of America's global power. But its presence on the table does not mean its use is always wise. Power is a tool. Strategy determines where and how that tool is applied. An operation can begin in hours. Managing its regional consequences can take years. History has shown us this time and again. When the regime fell in Iraq, headlines on the first day used the word victory. Months later, those headlines were filled with chaos, sectarian violence, and radicalization. Dismantling a state structure can happen faster than expected. Rebuilding stability requires patience, diplomacy, and international legitimacy. Iran is not an ordinary country. It is a regional actor with ideological networks and proxy forces. Its influence extends into Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. If the center is struck, the structure may not collapse, it may fragment uncontrollably, and fragmented power is often more unpredictable. That is how conflicts expand horizontally. A missile does not only strike a military installation, it strikes markets. Energy prices rise, shipping lanes become vulnerable, global supply chains tremble, major powers reposition themselves, Russia protects its interests, China calculates its energy security, European allies assess what escalation could mean for NATO. And this is where the issue grows larger. A conflict between the United States and Iran may not remain limited to those two countries. If regional actors enter the equation, alliance mechanisms begin to activate. And when alliances activate, crises cease to be local, they become global. One of the most important lessons I learned as president was this: military force comes into play when diplomacy fails. But when diplomacy disappears entirely, only escalation remains. What is most concerning today is not only the operation itself, the real question is whether a channel to de-escalate still exists. Because every conflict has a threshold. Once crossed, return becomes difficult. And if the parties reach a point where neither can afford to step back, events slip beyond the control of leaders. That is how world wars begin, not with a grand master plan, but with the accumulation of miscalculated small steps. Now we must ask, is this a limited demonstration of power or the first link in a chain of geopolitical rupture? The removal of a leader does not merely target a head of state. It triggers the reflexes of the state itself, and those reflexes can become the first steps toward an ultimate outcome. Iran responded to the United States and Israel not. only by targeting regional bases, but also by launching missile and drone attacks directly at opposing targets, including Israel. This intense and coordinated retaliation was the first indication that the crisis could evolve from a local confrontation into a broader war. According to Iranian statements, ballistic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles were launched toward Israel, setting off sirens in Tel Aviv and surrounding areas, and activating air defense systems. Iranian officials declared that U.S. and Israeli assets were legitimate targets, signaling that the retaliation was only the beginning. Such language was the clearest sign of potential escalation. This response extended beyond Israel, reaching American bases across the Gulf by targeting not only Israel but also U.S. military assets in the region. Iran significantly increased the risk of a multi-front conflict. The war was no longer confined within a single border. It was transforming into a regional crisis. Israel, in turn, went on high alert. Air defense systems were activated and civilian protection measures were intensified. Political pressure and military preparations mounted, making it clear that the bells of war were ringing, not only between Iran and the United States, but also through Israel. Direct exchanges of this kind do not create only momentary tension, they shake the foundations of regional stability and send shockwaves through military balances, economies, alliances, and energy markets. When a country is directly struck by missiles, it is not merely an attack, it is a signal of strategic transformation. And that transformation has the potential to shake not only the Middle East, but the entire global security architecture. The most dangerous aspect of any conflict is when retaliation is answered with a broader strike, turning a regional crisis into a global turning point. After Iran's missile attacks on Tel Aviv and other cities, the Israeli military did not limit itself to defense. It launched a wide-scale counteroffensive against Iran. The Israel Defense Forces conducted intensive airstrikes targeting Iran's military infrastructure and strategic sites, ballistic missile launch platforms, air defense systems, and military command centers were struck. The operation was framed as strategic defense and deterrence. The escalation was not only tactical but symbolic. Israel claimed to have achieved air superiority over Tehran and began striking security installations and command structures within Iran. Key units of the Revolutionary Guard and internal security facilities were targeted. This counterstrike was not merely retaliation, it was a message. Israel would not remain passive in the face of threats to its territory. Official statements emphasized that Iran's missile and defense capabilities had been significantly weakened. This marked one of the most extensive direct confrontations between Israel and Iran. While previous airstrikes and retaliations had occurred, the speed and scale of this escalation signaled that the crisis was no longer confined to two states. Strikes reaching into Tehran expanded the scope dramatically. Following these wide-scale air operations, emergency measures were declared, reserve forces mobilized, and civilian defense systems heightened. The confrontation was affecting not only battlefields, but entire societies. All of this demonstrates that the conflict has moved beyond a controllable threshold. Escalation is testing not only military equations, but global diplomacy and defense alliances. History teaches us that major wars rarely begin with grand strategies. They begin with small, miscalculated steps. One leader's decision becomes another's point of honor. Retaliation becomes reaction. And eventually, no one can hit the brakes. The direct clash between Iran and Israel has inevitably drawn America to the center of the equation. If Washington steps back, it risks appearing weak to its allies. If it fully commits, it becomes a direct party to the conflict. That is the strategic trap. Superpowers do not always choose wars. Sometimes wars choose them. American bases in the Gulf elevated their alert levels. NATO nations convened emergency security meetings. Russia and China issued cautious diplomatic statements while military movements rattled global markets. Oil prices fluctuated, stock exchanges trembled, defense spending surged, and the economy is often the first invisible front of war. And this is where the real danger begins. If a missile lands on the wrong target, if a defense system fails, if an ally believes it has been attacked, alliance mechanisms activate Article 5 of NATO regional defense agreements, military cooperation protocols. What appears local can rapidly become a global obligation. A world war today would not resemble the battle lines of the 1940s. It would unfold through cyber attacks, energy embargoes, proxy forces, and economic sanctions. Algorithms would fight alongside aircraft. Financial systems would become targets as much as armored divisions. And perhaps the most frightening truth is this: such a war would have no true winner. America's strength lies not only in its military capability, but in its alliances, diplomacy, and global credibility. If this crisis is mismanaged, instability could spread beyond the Middle East to Europe, Asia, and even the Pacific. The global order is fragile. Once cracked, it can take decades to repair. No one may realize that Trump's calculations could lead to a third world war. But history is full of leaders who did not fully foresee the consequences of their decisions. The question is not whether a war can begin. The real question is this: once it begins, can it be stopped? History books do not record intentions, they record outcomes. And sometimes those outcomes are shaped in the shadow of a single signature. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video.